Richard Thompson never imagined that a quiet move to the countryside would turn into a living nightmare. A history professor by trade, he and his family were searching for peace, and the remote town in upstate New York seemed to be the perfect escape. The farmhouse they found was everything they had hoped for: rustic, spacious, and surrounded by the kind of fall beauty that only New England could offer. As the leaves turned shades of orange and gold, they believed they'd finally found their sanctuary. The locals, though friendly, had their oddities. They spoke of strange happenings during the full moon in October, but Richard didn't think much of it. Superstitions in old towns like these were common after all. Settling in was easy. The air was crisp, the town quiet. Richard found comfort in the peaceful routine of his new life. He often sat on the porch with his wife, watching their daughter play in the backyard as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first few weeks, everything felt perfect, almost too perfect. Yet, there was something about the evenings that felt different here. It wasn't something he could pinpoint right away, just a subtle change in the atmosphere as the sun set earlier each day. The wind felt a little colder, the nights a bit darker, but that was just autumn settling in, or so he told himself. Richard's work at the university gave him a chance to explore the town's history. The farmhouse itself was a relic, steeped in stories of the past. There were whispers of an old curse tied to the land, something about the moon and spirits long forgotten. It was intriguing in a way only a historian could appreciate, but nothing more. He even found himself laughing at the tales the locals shared. His wife, on the other hand, wasn't so dismissive. She had always been more sensitive to the supernatural, though Richard considered it harmless fun. She'd light candles at night, muttering about protection, and while he played along, it felt unnecessary. They were safe here, weren't they? The first few nights passed without incident, and the family settled into a routine. But soon, the conversations around town became more pointed. Neighbors would glance at the sky when October came, speaking in hushed tones about the upcoming full moon. Richard brushed it off, though a small part of him started to wonder if there was more to these old tales than he'd initially thought. Still, he wasn't one to get rattled easily. He had a new job, a new home, and the fresh start his family needed. Life was finally turning a corner for them. As the days passed, the charm of the old farmhouse began to fade slightly. It wasn't anything drastic, just little things. A door that wouldn't stay shut, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. But these were common in old houses, especially ones with as much history as this. His wife joked that maybe they weren't alone, and Richard chuckled along. It was easier to laugh than admit that the house had started to feel different. It wasn't enough to worry him, but the feeling lingered in the back of his mind like a forgotten chore, waiting to be addressed. Autumn in upstate New York was beautiful, with the kind of picturesque scenes that made people forget their worries. But as the full moon grew closer, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The locals' stories, the unease he couldn't quite explain, the strange little things around the house. It was all building up to something. He just didn't know what. And as October wore on, the feeling of peace they'd found in the farmhouse began to feel more like a distant memory. It didn't take long after the move for things to take a strange turn. Richard first noticed it late at night when he was sitting up, grading papers in the study. The house was quiet, too quiet really. He could hear the wind rustling outside. But there was something else. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, but too distant to make out clearly. He paused for a moment, listening closely. When he checked the windows, expecting to see someone outside or maybe a stray animal, there was nothing. Just darkness and the cold, biting air that had started to settle in as fall deepened. At first, he didn't say anything about the noise. It seemed small, insignificant. Houses creaked, especially ones as old as theirs, and he figured it was just part of the house's natural ambiance. But the whispers kept coming back, almost every night now. His wife mentioned hearing them too, her expression more serious than his. She joked less about the farmhouse being haunted and started lighting more candles at night. It wasn't just the sounds, though. There was a heaviness in the air that neither of them could quite explain. a kind of pressure, like the house itself was slowly coming alive. One night, they both woke up at the same time, gasping for air. They couldn't move. Paralyzed in their bed, they lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling, unable to speak. Richard's mind raced as his body refused to respond, and in that terrifying stillness, he felt it, something in the room with them. It was as if a presence had settled over them, unseen but undeniably there. And just as suddenly as the paralysis took hold, it released them. They shot up in bed, hearts racing, but the room was empty. The sensation lingered, though, and sleep would not come easily after that. The next morning, Richard tried to laugh it off. Sleep paralysis wasn't unheard of, especially when stressed, and the move had been a big change for them all. But his wife wasn't laughing. She said she felt it too, that presence, like someone watching them in the dark. Richard had always been the rational one, the skeptic, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The whispers outside, the cold drafts that came out of nowhere, and now this. The unease that had been small at first was growing, festering. The nights became colder as the full moon approached. Richard found himself waking up at odd hours, sometimes drenched in sweat, other times shivering, no matter how many blankets they piled on. His wife started having vivid nightmares, but she wouldn't talk about them in detail, only shaking her head when he asked. Their daughter seemed unaffected, at least at first, but even she started to mention hearing funny noises outside her window. Richard dismissed it, trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy, but he could feel it slipping through his fingers. Then came the night when the whispers weren't just outside anymore. They were inside the house. Richard had woken up again, this time to the sound of low murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. He checked every room, but there was no one there. Nothing out of place. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. He didn't sleep that night, and by the time morning came, the feeling had only grown worse. His wife's silent looks told him she was feeling it too, though neither of them said it out loud. The full moon was nearing, and with it, the strange occurrences seemed to intensify. Richard couldn't quite explain it, but the house felt different, like it was waiting for something. He told himself it was just his imagination, just a coincidence, but deep down, he knew. Something was coming, and they were running out of time. As the full moon drew closer, things took a darker turn. Richard's wife, who had always been strong and steady, began to change. She looked tired all the time, as if the nightmares were draining the life out of her. Every morning she woke up more shaken than the day before. The dark figure from her dreams, she said, wasn't staying in her mind anymore. It was getting closer. Each night it stood a little nearer to their bed, its presence more suffocating, more real. Richard tried to comfort her, but he felt helpless. There was nothing he could do to pull her out of the spiral she was falling into. Their daughter started mentioning things too. At first it was small, a cold touch here, a strange shadow there. But it quickly escalated. She came running into their room one night, crying about something cold brushing against her while she slept. Richard went to her room to check, trying to calm her down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. He glanced around, hoping to find an open window or something that could explain the chill, but everything was sealed. The air, however, was freezing, far too cold for just a draft. Richard started seeing things himself, fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision, always darting away when he tried to focus. At first, he convinced himself it was just the stress getting to him, a trick of the mind. But the shadows grew bolder. There were times when he would catch them lingering longer than they should, just for a moment before they slipped back into the darkness. He felt like the house was playing with him, teasing him with glimpses of something lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the quiet rustling outside the windows. They became more insistent, more invasive, creeping into every corner of the house. At night, they filled the air, a constant, unnerving hum that seemed to seep into their minds. His wife started covering her ears, muttering that she couldn't take it anymore. Richard didn't blame her. He was barely holding it together himself. The sensation of being watched was unshakable now, as though something was always there, just out of sight, waiting. The house felt alive. Not in a warm, comforting way, but in the way a predator feels when it's stalking its prey. Richard noticed the changes, subtle at first, like the walls themselves were breathing. The once charming farmhouse they had loved so much was now something else entirely. The floors creaked with a rhythm that felt deliberate. The windows fogged up even when it wasn't cold outside, and every shadow seemed to carry a weight that pulled at their sanity. They weren't just living in the house anymore. They were trapped. Richard tried to focus on work, burying himself in his university papers, but it was no use. The house had become all-encompassing. His thoughts were consumed by the strange occurrences, by his wife's haunted eyes, and by the fear that their daughter wasn't safe. He wanted to leave, to run far away from this cursed place, but something kept him there. It wasn't just fear. It was like the house itself wouldn't let them go. It held them in its grip, tighter with each passing day. As the full moon loomed ever closer, the tension in the house became unbearable. Richard could feel it, like the air before a storm. Something was about to happen, something terrible, and they were powerless to stop it. Every instinct screamed at him to take his family and run, but it was too late. The house had already claimed them, and whatever was coming would not be denied. The shadows, the whispers, the nightmares, it was all leading to this, and Richard knew deep down that they wouldn't all make it through the night. The night of the full moon arrived with an eerie stillness that settled over the house. It was the kind of quiet that made Richard's skin crawl, like the calm before something catastrophic. He lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. His wife had been restless all day, pacing the house, muttering to herself in fragments of sentences he couldn't understand. Their daughter had fallen asleep early, blissfully unaware of the tension that wrapped itself around the house like a shroud. Richard wanted to believe that maybe nothing would happen, that maybe they'd imagined it all. But deep down, he knew better. The first scream came just after midnight. It was his wife. Her voice pierced the silence, sending Richard bolting upright. She was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent cry of terror. Her body was stiff, locked in the same terrifying paralysis that had gripped them before, but this time she wasn't alone. Richard's blood ran cold as he saw it, the dark figure from her nightmares, standing at the foot of their bed. It wasn't a fleeting shadow anymore. It was real, solid, looming over them like a manifestation of pure malice. He tried to move, to reach for her, but his body refused to respond. The paralysis had him again, locking him in place, forcing him to watch helplessly as the figure drew closer to his wife. Her eyes darted to him, pleading, terrified. But there was nothing he could do. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, making it hard to breathe, harder to think. The figure reached out, and with a slow, deliberate movement, it placed its hand on her chest. And then she was gone, just like that. No sound, no struggle. Her body vanished, as though it had never been there in the first place. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, every beat loud and frantic as the paralysis finally released him. He shot up, shouting her name, but there was nothing, no trace of her. The bed was empty. Panic set in, wild and uncontrollable, as he ran through the house, calling for her, searching every room. His daughter woke up, confused and scared, but he couldn't stop to explain. All he knew was that the house had taken her, swallowed her whole, and the dark figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. They had to get out. Now. Richard grabbed his daughter's hand, pulling her through the house as they raced toward the front door. But the house fought back. The air felt thick, like moving through water, and every step was harder than the last. The whispers were deafening now, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. Shadows stretched across the walls, growing longer and darker with each passing moment. The house itself seemed to twist around them, warping into something unrecognizable, something alive and hungry. By the time they reached the front door, Richard could feel the presence right behind them. It was close, too close. His hands fumbled with the lock, the cold metal slippery beneath his fingers as the shadows closed in. For a moment, He thought they wouldn't make it. The door wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was holding it shut. But then, with a loud creak, it swung open, and they stumbled out into the cold night air. Richard didn't stop to catch his breath. They ran, as fast as they could, through the yard and into the woods beyond, the whispers still chasing them. But even as they fled, Richard knew it wasn't over. The spirit wasn't bound to the house. It was tied to the land, to the full moon in October, just as the legends had warned. And now, it had taken his wife. It had fed on their fear, grown stronger with every moment they stayed, and now it was coming for them. The moon hung high above, glowing brighter than it ever had before, casting long shadows across the ground. They had escaped the house, but Richard could feel it. The spirit was still watching, still waiting. They couldn't outrun it. Not forever. The woods weren't much safer than the house had been. Richard could feel the spirit's presence all around them, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him and his daughter as they stumbled through the underbrush. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows in the pale light of the full moon, making everything seem twisted and wrong. His daughter clung to his hand, her small fingers trembling, but neither of them spoke. What was there to say? They had escaped the house, but the danger was far from over. Richard's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan, but all he could focus on was the growing sense of dread creeping up his spine. The further they ran, the louder the whispers became, as if the spirit was closing in on them from all sides. Richard's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw the shadows moving, stretching unnaturally across the forest floor. The moonlight, once a comforting glow, now felt more like a spotlight, exposing them to the unseen force that hunted them. He didn't know where they were going. Just away. Away from the farmhouse, away from the thing that had taken his wife. Suddenly, they broke through the tree line, and Richard realized they had reached the edge of town. The small, sleepy village that had once felt like a refuge now seemed foreign, almost threatening. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, as if the town itself had been abandoned. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse loud in his ears. He couldn't stop shaking, couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. His daughter tugged at his sleeve, her voice small and scared as she asked if they were safe now. Richard didn't have the heart to lie to her. He led them to the first house with lights on, banging on the door like a madman until someone finally answered. It was an older woman, her eyes wide with confusion as she took in their disheveled appearance. Richard didn't have time to explain everything. All he could manage was a frantic plea for help. She ushered them inside, but the moment they crossed the threshold, Richard felt it again, that same oppressive presence. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with something unnatural. The woman looked at him with pity, and it was then that Richard realized she knew. She had known all along. The locals had warned them about the full moon in October, about the spirit that haunted these lands. They had tried to tell him, but he hadn't listened. Now, it was too late. The woman spoke in a hushed tone, telling him about the curse, about how the spirit claimed a new victim every October. It was bound to the land, to the moon itself, feeding on fear and despair. Richard's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. There was no escaping it. His wife was gone, and soon it would come for them too. Even as the woman spoke, Richard felt the spirit's presence growing stronger, as if it had followed them into the house. The whispers were back, louder than ever, echoing through the walls, growing more insistent with each passing second. His daughter clung to him, her small body trembling with fear. The woman looked at them with sadness in her eyes, but she offered no solutions, no way out. There wasn't one. The spirit wasn't done with them. As they sat there in the flickering light of the old woman's living room, Richard glanced out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, glowing impossibly bright, larger than he had ever seen it before. It felt like it was watching them, like it was waiting for something. And in that moment, Richard knew. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The spirit was still out there, still hungry, still watching. And one day, it would come for them again. Jacob Mitchell, a 38-year-old accountant from Manhattan, was not one to shy away from traditions. For years, his fall camping trips had been something of a ritual, a time to unplug and reconnect with nature alongside his wife and 2 young children. The forests of upstate New York had always offered a peaceful respite from the hustle of city life. This year, however, was different. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the early arrival of the autumn leaves. It was something else. A sense of unease hung over him, gnawing at the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't quite reach. He couldn't explain it, but there it was, an unsettling weight that refused to lift. The drive up had been pleasant enough, but as they got closer to the campsite, Jacob couldn't help but notice how quiet the woods were. Not the good kind of quiet, but an eerie, heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. His wife, Rebecca, didn't seem to notice. She was too busy keeping the kids entertained with silly songs and games. The kids, of course, were completely oblivious. Why would they be? To them, this was just another adventure. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes kept darting toward the dense tree line, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something lurking. By the time they arrived at their usual spot, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light filtered through the orange and red leaves, casting everything in a warm, comforting glow. Normally, Jacob would have felt at ease by now, but that nagging sense of being watched only grew stronger. As he unloaded the car, his gaze kept drifting to the shadows between the trees. Every time he told himself it was nothing, just nerves. But still, there was that itch, that gut feeling he couldn't ignore. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Rebecca started setting up the tent with the kids, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. It should have been a peaceful moment, but Jacob found himself scanning the tree line again and again, looking for something, anything, that might explain the weird vibe. The shadows seemed longer, darker than they should have been. And though he couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, the feeling that they weren't alone clung to him like a second skin. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off, but it didn't help. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped quickly. The fire was lit, and they all gathered around to roast marshmallows and tell ghost stories. This was usually Jacob's favorite part of the trip. Watching the kids' faces light up in the flickering glow, listening to Rebecca's familiar voice, it should have been perfect. But even in the warm light of the fire, that eerie feeling refused to leave him. Every so often, Jacob caught himself glancing over his shoulder, his eyes searching the blackness beyond the campsite. It was then, in the middle of one of Rebecca's stories, that Jacob swore he saw something move in the distance. Just a flicker, a shadow slipping between the trees. He blinked, telling himself it was just his imagination. But when he looked again, the shadow was still there, just at the edge of his vision. It didn't make sense. How could something so dark stand out against the night? He wanted to say something to Rebecca, but the words wouldn't come. What would he even say? "Hey, I think there's something in the woods." It sounded ridiculous, even in his head. But as they all turned in for the night, that shadowy figure stayed with him, haunting his thoughts. He lay in the tent, staring up at the canvas roof, listening to the rustle of the trees outside. His family slept soundly beside him, but Jacob couldn't. That sense of being watched had settled deep into his bones now. Something was out there. He was sure of it. But what? He didn't know. Not yet, anyway. The next morning, Jacob woke up feeling as though he hadn't slept at all. The sense of unease from the night before lingered like a bad dream, but he tried to shake it off. After all, this was supposed to be a family trip, a break from reality. Rebecca was already up, brewing coffee over the campfire, and the kids were chasing each other around the campsite. Everything seemed normal, but Jacob's eyes kept drifting back to the trees. That shadowy figure from last night, it was still on his mind. As they settled into the day, Jacob decided to distract himself by keeping busy. He helped the kids gather firewood and set up a small hiking trail nearby. But no matter what he did, he couldn't stop feeling like they weren't alone. Every time he glanced toward the forest, he thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A dark shape just beyond the tree line, moving silently between the trees. He tried to tell himself it was just a trick of the light. But the more he looked, the more he was convinced there was something there. Jacob didn't say anything to Rebecca at first. He didn't want to worry her, and he certainly didn't want to freak out the kids. But as the day wore on, the shadow appeared more frequently. It never stayed long, just a fleeting glimpse, enough to make his heart race. Sometimes it was close to the campsite, other times it was further away, but it was always there, just out of reach, like a predator watching its prey. It was unsettling, to say the least, and Jacob could feel the tension building inside him. Rebecca, of course, didn't notice anything strange. She was too caught up in enjoying the trip, laughing with the kids, making s'mores by the fire. Jacob envied her ability to relax, but he couldn't bring himself to let his guard down. The shadow, whatever it was, felt like it was getting closer. The more he ignored it, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. It was almost as if the figure was toying with him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But Jacob wasn't ready for that moment, not yet. By the afternoon, the kids began to complain about feeling cold, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was strange. There was no breeze, no change in temperature that Jacob could feel, but both of them insisted they were freezing. Rebecca wrapped them in blankets and made jokes about the mystical fall chill. But Jacob wasn't laughing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had something to do with it. There was a connection there, a link between the presence in the woods and the sudden drop in temperature that only the kids seemed to feel. As night began to fall again, Jacob's anxiety spiked. The fire crackled to life once more, casting long shadows across the campsite, but Jacob's eyes were fixed on the trees. That dark figure, it was out there. He knew it, and it was getting bolder. He could sense it, just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching, waiting. His pulse quickened as he scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but the figure remained elusive, always on the edge of his vision, never quite coming into focus. Jacob couldn't take it anymore. He finally pulled Rebecca aside, his voice low and tense as he told her about the shadow he'd been seeing. She listened, her expression shifting from amusement to concern, but she didn't seem convinced. "It's probably just your imagination," she said softly, trying to reassure him. "You've been stressed with work. Maybe you're just seeing things." But Jacob knew what he'd seen, and he knew it wasn't just in his head. Something was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it showed itself. That night, as they settled into the tent once again, Jacob lay awake, his mind racing. The fire outside cast a dim glow through the tent walls, but it did little to calm his nerves. The figure was out there, he could feel it, and this time, he had the distinct feeling that it wasn't going to stay hidden for much longer. As the night deepened, Jacob lay in his sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his wife and children beside him. The crackling of the fire outside had grown softer, but there was another sound now, something faint, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the wind, nor the usual rustle of the forest. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, a soft murmur that seemed to drift through the trees. Jacob sat up, straining to hear, his heart racing in his chest. Then it came again. This time, he could make it out more clearly. A voice. Jacob's first instinct was to wake Rebecca, but something stopped him. The voice, was it hers? No, that didn't make any sense. She was right next to him, fast asleep. But the sound was unmistakable. Somewhere, beyond the tent, he heard Rebecca's voice calling, faint and echoing through the trees. His blood ran cold as the realization hit him. It wasn't Rebecca, but it sounded just like her. How was that even possible? He froze, listening, as the voice called again, this time more clearly, beckoning from the darkness just outside the camp. The kids stirred beside him, and Jacob's son, a 10-year-old with an adventurous spirit, sat up groggily. "Dad, did you hear that?" he whispered. Jacob nodded, his throat tight. His son looked confused, rubbing his eyes. "Mom's outside. I think she's calling us." Jacob's stomach turned. The voice wasn't his wife's, but it had lured his children awake, just like that. His daughter, younger and more timid, sat up as well. her small face filled with sleepy confusion. "Why's Mom outside?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to act fast. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. He threw on his shoes and unzipped the tent, stepping into the cold night air. The forest was eerily still, and the fire had nearly died out, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. He glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but the voice had stopped. The trees loomed tall and silent, and there was no one there. But Jacob knew something was out there, lurking just beyond the light of the dying fire. Then the voice came again. "Jacob, come here." It was Rebecca's voice, clear as day, but with a coldness to it that chilled him to the bone. It came from the edge of the woods, where the shadows were deepest. His breath caught in his throat. That was not his wife. There was no mistaking it now. Something was imitating her, something dark and malevolent. He looked back at the tent, at his children who were sitting up, wide-eyed, waiting for him to return. He couldn't let them get closer to the trees. Whatever was out there, it wanted them. Just as Jacob was about to turn back to the tent, his son, without warning, stood up and began walking toward the tree line. "Mom!" the boy called, his voice filled with innocent confusion. Jacob lunged toward him, grabbing his arm before he could take another step. "No!" he hissed, pulling him back. His son looked up at him, startled and scared. "But I heard her, Dad. She's out there." Jacob's grip tightened. "That's not your mom," he said, his voice trembling. "Get back in the tent, now." The children hesitated, but they listened, retreating back into the safety of the tent. Jacob stayed outside, his eyes fixed on the dark forest, waiting for the voice to call again. But it didn't. Instead, there was only silence, the kind that made his skin crawl. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he scanned the trees, his heart pounding in his ears. The fire flickered weakly at his feet, casting feeble light against the encroaching darkness. Whatever was out there, it was watching, waiting for its chance to strike. Jacob didn't sleep that night. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made him jump, his eyes darting toward the trees as if expecting the shadowy figure to step into the light. But it never did. By morning, the unease had grown unbearable, and the weight of what had happened gnawed at him. He hadn't told Rebecca about the voice that mimicked her. He didn't want to scare her or the kids more than they already were. But something had to be done. He couldn't just wait for this thing to make its move. The day was overcast, the sun hidden behind thick gray clouds that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Jacob tried to go through the motions of a normal camping day, fishing with his son, helping Rebecca cook breakfast. But the forest felt different. It wasn't just the strange silence anymore. There was a presence, a feeling of being watched, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Jacob couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure he'd seen the night before, the way it seemed to move between the trees, always watching, always waiting. As the afternoon wore on, the tension became too much to bear. Jacob decided to take a walk, to clear his head and get away from the oppressive feeling that hung over the campsite. He didn't stray far, just enough to put some distance between him and the others. But as he walked, he felt it again, that cold, creeping sensation that he wasn't alone. He turned, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of it. The figure, standing between two trees, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a twisted mass of darkness that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. For a moment, Jacob froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there watching him. He could feel its eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. His mouth went dry as he tried to force himself to look away, but he couldn't. It was as if the shadow was holding him in place, its presence overwhelming. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the figure took a step toward him. Panic surged through Jacob, and he turned, running back toward the camp, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. When he burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, Rebecca looked up in surprise. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. But Jacob couldn't speak. He couldn't explain what he'd seen, what he felt. The shadow wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. He glanced toward the trees, half expecting to see the figure standing there. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of the woods, the cold wind rustling through the leaves. But Jacob knew better now. He knew what was out there. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Jacob's anxiety grew with each passing minute. The fire was lit once again, but this time, its warmth did nothing to calm his nerves. He could feel the demon's presence growing stronger, feel it closing in on them. And then, without warning, the children began to act strange. His son stood up suddenly, his eyes blank, as if in a trance. His daughter followed, their movements slow and robotic as they started walking toward the trees, toward the figure. Jacob's heart stopped. He lunged for them, grabbing them by the arms and pulling them back toward the fire. "No!" he shouted, his voice shaking with fear. But the kids didn't respond. Their eyes were glazed over, their faces expressionless, as if they were under some kind of spell. Jacob turned to Rebecca, panic in his voice. "Help me!" But before she could react, a force, something unseen, pushed Jacob back, knocking him to the ground. The figure had come closer now, towering over the tree line, its shadow stretching across the ground like a dark stain. Jacob scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he tried to pull the children away from the trees. But the force was stronger now, more tangible. It was as if the demon was reaching out, wrapping its shadowy fingers around them, pulling them in. Jacob could feel the cold grip tightening, feel the fear rising in his chest. The figure was no longer just watching. It was acting, feeding on their fear, on their confusion. He had to stop it. But how? Jacob didn't have time to think. He grabbed his children with all the strength he had left, pulling them back toward the campsite, away from the looming figure. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought against the invisible force pulling them toward the trees. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to come from the very presence of the demon. Rebecca screamed for them to hurry, but her voice seemed distant, muffled, as if the forest itself was swallowing the sound. The car was their only chance. Jacob knew they had to get out of there, had to leave before the demon claimed them all. He shouted at Rebecca to grab the keys, his voice barely audible over the deafening silence that now pressed in around them. The children, still dazed and unresponsive, stumbled along beside him, their feet dragging as if they were being pulled back by invisible chains. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching out into an eternity as they inched closer to the car. Rebecca fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she unlocked the doors. Jacob practically threw the kids into the back seat, slamming the door shut behind them before jumping into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, but the demon wasn't done with them yet. As they sped down the dirt road, the trees seemed to close in on them, the shadows twisting and writhing in the headlights. Jacob's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. But no matter how fast they went, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Behind them, the demon's presence was palpable, a dark weight that pressed down on their every move. Jacob could feel it, like cold fingers brushing the back of his neck, a constant reminder that they were not out of danger. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure looming behind them, but all he saw were the twisted, gnarled branches of the trees, reaching out like skeletal hands. The road seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before, and Jacob's stomach churned with the realization that they were still trapped. The demon wasn't letting them leave. Rebecca's voice broke the silence, her tone panicked as she asked, "Are we going in circles?" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that the car wasn't moving fast enough, the road wasn't ending, and the demon's presence wasn't fading. The further they drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows thickening until it felt like they were driving through a tunnel of darkness. The headlights barely cut through the gloom, and Jacob's pulse quickened with the sinking realization that there was no escaping this. Just when he thought the road would never end, they broke through the trees and into the open. The relief was short-lived, however, as Jacob's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror one last time. The figure, the demon, was still there, standing at the edge of the forest, watching them with eyes that he couldn't see but could feel. It wasn't going to follow them. Not now. It didn't need to. Jacob knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The demon was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next family to come too close, to stray into its domain. The car sped away, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. The forest, the demon, had let them go, for now. But Jacob knew there was no peace in that. There would never be peace again. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that moved in the corner of his eye, would be a reminder that the demon was still out there, watching, waiting. And Jacob, no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he tried to escape, could never shake the feeling that it would come for him again one day. The terror wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Sarah Delaney wasn't the kind of person who scared easily. As a freelance photographer in Portland, she was used to exploring the hidden corners of the world, often in complete isolation. This particular autumn afternoon seemed no different. The forest around her was alive with vibrant hues of orange, red, and gold. The crunch of leaves beneath her boots echoed in the otherwise quiet woods, creating a rhythm that had always felt comforting. But as she ventured deeper, that comfortable silence began to feel different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about the air felt heavier, colder even, though the sun was still high in the sky. Stumbling upon the cemetery had been a complete accident. Sarah had no idea there was one hidden in these woods, but there it was, tucked away behind dense undergrowth, as if it had been purposely forgotten by time. The headstones were ancient, some leaning at odd angles, others barely recognizable with the names long faded from erosion. She pulled out her camera, thinking how eerie yet captivating these images would be. As she snapped a few shots, a strange urge tugged at her, pulling her closer to one of the oldest graves. It didn't have a name she could read, but the soil around it seemed disturbed. Against her better judgment, she knelt beside the grave, brushing her hand over the dirt. The ground felt unusually soft, as though it had just been turned over. Sarah knew she shouldn't mess with it. Logic told her to walk away, but curiosity was a powerful thing. She dug her fingers into the earth, just a bit, just to see what lay beneath. As she did, a shiver ran up her spine, the kind that wasn't just from the cold. She glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed, though there wasn't a soul in sight. Something shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle but unmistakable change, as if the very forest had exhaled a long-held breath. She stood up quickly, dusting off her hands, trying to shake off the strange sensation creeping over her. Maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks. After all, she had been out here alone for hours, and the mind can wander when left in silence for too long. But the weight of that silence now felt suffocating. The woods, once so vibrant and alive, now felt oppressive, almost like they were watching her. Deciding she'd gotten enough photos for the day, Sarah turned to leave, her pace quickening, though she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her from the shadows. That night, back in her small apartment in Portland, Sarah tried to push the day's events from her mind, but as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the stillness of the forest seemed to follow her. The images of the cemetery replayed over and over in her head. She could still feel the strange energy around that grave, the coldness of the soil, and the way the air seemed to shift around her. Sleep came, but it wasn't restful. Her dreams were filled with images of cracked tombstones, shifting shadows, and something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. When she woke the next morning, a sense of unease clung to her. She brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere of the graveyard. But as she prepared for her day, she couldn't help but glance out the window more often than usual, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing just outside. The day after her hike, Sarah noticed something was off. It wasn't anything she could put into words at first, just an odd feeling that clung to her like a shadow. The morning air was colder than usual, and the apartment, which was normally filled with the hum of city life outside, felt disturbingly quiet. She chalked it up to a restless night and tried to shake it off, But that lingering sense of being watched never quite left. As she made her way to her usual coffee shop, she couldn't stop herself from glancing over her shoulder, convinced someone or something was there. That night, things got worse. Sarah had always been a sound sleeper, but this time she woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. Her room was freezing, much colder than it should have been, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. As she pulled the covers tighter around herself, she felt it, a soft, cold touch, like icy fingers brushing against her arm. She shot up in bed, heart pounding, but when she looked around, nothing was there. It had to be her imagination, right? Sleep paralysis, maybe? She tried to reason with herself, but deep down, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was very wrong. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Shadows in her apartment seemed to move on their own, flickering in the corners of her vision. At first, she thought it was just the changing light outside, but the shadows grew more defined, more sinister, almost like figures standing just beyond her reach. Every night, the sensation of cold hands brushing against her returned, and each time, it felt more real, more tangible. The feeling of being watched never left, even in the daylight. She started closing the curtains during the day, but no matter how many times she tried to shut the world out, the unsettling presence still lingered. Sarah's dreams had always been vivid, but now they were nightmares. Every night she dreamt of the graveyard, of the cracked headstones and the shifting soil. But now there was something more, something dark and shadowy moving between the graves, always just out of sight. It never showed itself fully, but she could feel it. The cold, the darkness, the oppressive weight of its presence. It was always there, lurking. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, but the terror never truly left her. The line between her dreams and reality started to blur. One morning, she woke up to find dirt under her fingernails. She hadn't been near the cemetery since that day, so how could that be? The soil was dark, the kind you'd find deep in the forest, and the sight of it sent chills down her spine. Had she sleepwalked? Was she somehow returning to the grave in her sleep? The more she tried to make sense of it, the less sense it made. Every logical explanation crumbled under the weight of the growing fear that something was following her, something that had been disturbed when she dug into that grave. Sarah tried to confide in her friends, but they dismissed her fears. "You're just overworked," they'd say. "It's the stress getting to you." She wanted to believe them, but how could she explain the shadows, the cold hands, the nightmares that left her gasping for breath? How could she explain the feeling of dread that now followed her everywhere? She started avoiding people, too embarrassed to share what she was experiencing. But the more she isolated herself, the stronger the presence seemed to grow, as if it thrived on her fear and loneliness. And then, one night, she saw it. Just for a split second, out of the corner of her eye, something dark, something tall and twisted, standing in the corner of her bedroom. She froze, too terrified to move. The figure didn't come closer, didn't say a word, but its presence was suffocating. She blinked and it was gone, but the chill in the room remained. That was the moment Sarah knew. This wasn't just her imagination. This wasn't sleep paralysis or stress or any of the other excuses she had tried to convince herself of. Something had followed her home from the cemetery, and it wasn't going to leave. As the days turned colder and autumn settled in deeper, the presence in Sarah's life became undeniable. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. Now she could see fleeting movements just outside her windows, the rustle of leaves too rhythmic to be caused by the wind alone. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage with eyes on her at all times. Every time a leaf fell outside, a shiver ran through her, as though each one brought that thing closer. The nights, especially, grew more sinister, with the sensation of icy fingers brushing her skin becoming more distinct, more real. One evening, as Sarah sat on her couch, trying to focus on anything other than the dread building in her chest, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of leaves falling outside. But this time, it wasn't the soft, natural rustling she had grown used to. It was deliberate, methodical. The sound grew louder, filling the apartment, as if the leaves were gathering around her, pressing against the windows, trapping her inside. She froze, her heart racing. The shadows in the room grew darker, longer, almost as if they were reaching toward her. And then she saw it, just for a moment, something outside the window, watching her. At first, it was just a blur, a shadowy figure barely visible through the glass. But as the leaves continued to fall, Sarah realized with a sickening certainty that the figure wasn't just watching, it was moving closer. Every time another leaf hit the ground, the dark form solidified a little more. She could make out its shape now, tall and twisted, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at her, drawing her in, despite the terror gripping her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled away from the window, her mind racing. It wasn't supposed to be real. This couldn't be real. But as she backed into the corner of the room, she heard the sound again. The leaves, falling one by one, drawing the figure closer and closer. She could see it now, standing just outside, its hollow eyes locked on hers. The air around her grew cold, and she could feel its presence pushing against the glass, almost as if it was testing the boundary, waiting for the right moment to slip through and claim her. Night after night, the figure grew bolder. It no longer stayed outside the windows, content to watch from a distance. Now, it pressed its twisted form against the glass, the outlines of its limbs becoming clearer with every passing night. Its hollow eyes never wavered from Sarah, as if it was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each moment she spent trapped in its gaze. And every time a leaf fell, the darkness inside her apartment seemed to thicken, as though the very walls were conspiring to pull her into the shadows. By now, Sarah was barely sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, the figure appeared in her dreams, standing at the foot of her bed, its twisted face looming over her. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, to push it away, it was always there, creeping closer, its cold breath brushing against her skin. She knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the boundary between her dreams and reality shattered completely, and the thing outside her window finally found its way in. The worst part was, Sarah couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe her? Who would understand the terror of being hunted by a shadow, by something that only existed when the leaves fell? Every day she grew more isolated, more withdrawn, as if the demon's presence was slowly consuming her, feeding off her fear and despair. She tried to leave, to escape the apartment, but no matter where she went, the figure followed. It was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next leaf to fall, for the next step in its twisted game. And then, one night, as the wind howled outside and the leaves fell in a steady, relentless rhythm, Sarah realized with a sinking dread that the figure was no longer outside. It was inside. The shadows stretched long across the floor, creeping toward her, and in the center of the room, the figure stood, its hollow eyes fixed on hers, its body fully formed at last. There was no escape now. The demon had emerged, and it wasn't leaving until it had claimed her. With the demon now inside her home, Sarah's once stable reality unraveled quickly. It didn't take long before she realized that no amount of distance could protect her from its cold, suffocating presence. Wherever she went, it followed, lingering just out of sight, waiting for her in every shadow, every flicker of darkness. She thought leaving town might help, so she packed her things in a frenzy and drove as far as she could. But even then, the leaves falling outside her car window seemed to mock her. With each one that hit the ground, she could feel the demon's icy breath on the back of her neck, even though there was no one else in the car. Returning to her apartment was a decision made out of desperation. There was nowhere else to go, and no one who would believe her anyway. Her friends stopped answering her calls, tired of her increasingly frantic messages about shadows and figures in the night. She couldn't blame them. They had their own lives, their own problems, and none of them wanted to get pulled into whatever nightmare Sarah was living. So, she locked herself inside her apartment, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to pretend that the world outside didn't exist. But the demon had grown too strong for that. Every night, the temperature in the apartment dropped to unbearable lows. Sarah would huddle under layers of blankets, but the cold would seep through, chilling her to the bone. And always, there were the sounds. The leaves rustling outside, the floor creaking under invisible footsteps, the soft scrape of something sharp dragging along the walls. It was inescapable. No matter how tightly she shut her eyes, the demon was there, standing in the corner of her room, watching. She started sleeping during the day, hoping the light would keep it at bay, but even that became impossible. The demon thrived in the darkness, and it was getting harder to tell where the shadows ended and the creature began. Sarah's grip on reality slipped further with each passing day. She stopped eating, stopped caring about anything outside the immediate terror of her apartment. Her reflection in the mirror looked gaunt, her skin pale and her eyes sunken with sleeplessness. The once vibrant photographer who loved to explore had been replaced by someone hollow, someone broken. The demon had taken everything from her: her peace, her sanity, her hope. Every moment of every day was spent waiting for the next inevitable encounter, the next leaf to fall, signaling that the demon was drawing closer, tightening its hold on her. She tried to fight back at first. Sarah lit candles, hung crosses, burned sage, anything she could think of to drive the demon away. But none of it worked. The demon wasn't just haunting her. It had become a part of her world, feeding off her fear and despair. The more she fought, the stronger it seemed to grow. Lights would flicker, doors would slam shut without warning, and the sense of cold hands brushing against her skin became constant. There was no escape from it, no way to push it back. It was relentless, always there, always watching. In the rare moments of clarity, Sarah wondered if maybe this was what the demon wanted all along. To drive her mad, to strip away her sense of self until there was nothing left but fear and emptiness. And it was working. She could feel herself slipping further and further into the darkness, her mind fracturing under the weight of the constant terror. Every time she blinked, the demon was there, closer than before, its hollow eyes boring into her soul, its twisted form looming larger with each passing moment. And yet, through it all, there was still a part of her that clung to the hope of escape, a desperate sliver of herself that refused to give in completely. She couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep letting the demon control her every thought, her every breath. But how do you fight something that isn't bound by the rules of the physical world? How do you break free from a presence that exists in every shadow, every whisper of the wind? These questions plagued her, gnawed at her, as she sat alone in her apartment, waiting for the next inevitable attack, knowing that her time was running out. On the night that everything fell apart, the storm outside was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The wind howled through the trees, and the leaves fell in torrents, swirling in chaotic patterns outside her window. The sense of dread that had haunted her for weeks reached its peak, settling deep in her chest like a stone. She knew, in some unspoken part of herself, that this night was different. The demon had been growing stronger, more aggressive, and it was only a matter of time before it made its final move. She couldn't wait any longer. Something had to be done. Gathering what little strength she had left, Sarah made the decision to return to the cemetery. It was a desperate act, fueled by exhaustion and fear, but in her mind, it was the only option. She hoped, prayed, that if she could return to the place where it all started, maybe she could end it. So, she threw on a jacket, grabbed her flashlight, and ventured back into the storm. The drive through the dark, winding roads felt surreal, the wind pushing against her car as if trying to keep her from reaching her destination. But Sarah pressed on, determined to confront whatever lay waiting for her in those woods. When she arrived at the cemetery, the storm had only intensified. The trees swayed violently, and the leaves whipped around her, obscuring her vision. But the cemetery itself stood in eerie stillness, as though untouched by the chaos surrounding it. The tombstones, cracked and worn, seemed to glow faintly in the storm's dark light. Sarah moved quickly toward the grave she had disturbed weeks ago, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The soil around the grave had shifted once more, the ground looking freshly disturbed, as though something beneath the earth had been clawing its way out. As Sarah knelt by the grave, The cold hit her with full force. It wasn't the natural chill of autumn. This was something darker, something alive. The wind seemed to die down for a moment, and in the silence that followed, Sarah could hear it, the slow, deliberate rustling of leaves falling one by one. She turned, and there it was, the demon, fully formed now, standing at the edge of the cemetery. Its twisted body towered over the gravestones, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, filled with hunger, with intent. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as if the demon's presence alone was enough to suffocate her. Sarah wanted to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The demon moved toward her, each step slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Its long, twisted limbs scraped against the ground, and the closer it got, the colder the air became. She could feel its breath on her skin, could see the empty darkness in its eyes, and as it reached her, its cold, bony hand reached out, brushing against her face. The sensation was paralyzing, her mind overwhelmed by a wave of fear so intense that it shattered her last grip on reality. When they found Sarah days later, she was wandering aimlessly through the woods, her eyes blank, her mind shattered. She couldn't speak, couldn't respond to anything around her. The doctor said she was catatonic, her mind locked in some distant place, beyond reach. They couldn't explain how she had survived the storm, or how she had ended up so far from the cemetery. All they knew was that something had broken her in ways they couldn't fix. And though her body was safe, her mind was lost in the dark. But the demon was not done. It remained in the woods, its hunger insatiable, waiting for the next curious soul to disturb its resting place. The leaves continued to fall, and with each one the demon grew stronger, ready to claim its next victim.